Hello and welcome to this presentation on vegetarian versus flexitarian. Can eating healthy still include meat? My name is Richard Rosenfeld. I'm a distinguished professor at the SUNY Downstate Health Sciences University. I eat a whole food plant-based diet and I'm board certified in lifestyle medicine. This presentation is for all audiences, lay persons, the public, consumers, and health professionals and educators. I'll keep the narration hopefully very simple and clear, and those who are interested can find more details in some of the slides. Thinking about vegetarian versus flexitarian, it helps to first understand what is a flexitarian. It's basically someone who's flexible about their approach to meat, and as shown here, they tend to eat meat a few times per month, maybe weekly, or at most a few times per week, but it is not the main portion of their diet. How much meat, beef, chicken, fish are Americans eating, including these flexitarians? Well, it may surprise you that according to the United States Department of Agriculture, it is upwards of 140 pounds per year per person. That's a little over 6 ounces per day. In the past half century, chicken has displaced beef as the leader, but beef is still quite prominent. Why do people do this? Are there reasons that people eat so much meat? And a review here of 54 studies of omnivores. Omnivores are people who eat meat and pretty much anything they want, showed that they consider meat to be essential. It's a source of protein. They need it for their health. They enjoy eating meat, and they're not that eager to give it up. And even if they did, they probably don't know what to substitute. It's not surprising that people eat lots of meat given the current dietary guidelines for Americans from the Department of Agriculture, shown here for a 2,000 calorie diet. They recommend lots of protein foods. And what are they? Meat, poultry, and eggs, 26 ounces per week. Add another 8 ounces of seafood, and only a meager 5 ounces per week of nuts, seeds, and soy products. In some of the other foods, we see fairly modest amounts of beans, peas, and lentils, a cup and a half a week. Whole grains are nice, but they recommend equal amounts of refined grains and lots of dairy. No wonder people are not eating perhaps as healthy as they should. Is eating all this meat, this 140 pounds or more a year, good for your health? Well, let's see. I think some of the earliest clues come from T. Colin Campbell at Cornell University when he published a China study looking at many different geographic areas in China. Over 6,500 people, followed them for decades. They don't eat a lot of meat, but it varied. And they found that their rates of heart disease were lower with green vegetables and higher with salt and this thing called apolipoprotein B. Apolipoprotein B is a substance that contributes to those bad cholesterol things in your body, the lipoproteins, the LDL. So apolipoprotein B is not good for you. And guess what? If you eat a lot of meat, you do get lots of apolipoproteins. And if you eat plants, it goes down. We can look at eating meat from the perspective of overall health and examine what are called systematic reviews, studies where people locate, appraise, and synthesize evidence using very rigorous methods. Shown here are 4 different systematic reviews, including many studies. When we put it all together, eating meat is associated with more cholesterol and triglycerides in the blood, higher blood pressure, higher rates of obesity, dying earlier, and higher rates of diabetes and cancer, particularly colon and gastrointestinal cancer, and heart disease. Legumes are another source of protein instead of meat, and that includes beans, peas, lentils, and chickpeas. We can compare them here, and we see that legumes are some of the highest fiber foods, whereas meat, poultry, and fish do not have fiber. We used to think that a lot of the problems with meat came from the fat, the saturated fat, the cholesterol, and they aren't good for you, that's true, but More recently, this TMAO, trimethyl and amine, has been found to be a real troublemaker. It occurs during meat digestion, and it's associated with all sorts of problems: deaths, strokes, heart attacks, heart failure, even kidney disease. And the source of this TMAO appears to be our own body, the bacteria in your gut, so-called microbiome. We have trillions of bacteria and microbes in our body, and when you feed them animal protein, beef, chicken, fish, they produce TMAO, trimethylamine N oxide, which gives you all the adverse effects, the heart attack, strokes, and other problems. But if you feed your microbiome fiber from all those healthy legumes and plant proteins, you get instead butyrate, a short-chain fatty acid that's protective. As the cartoon notes here, when the fiber hits your gut, your microbiome is busy producing butyrate, a short-chain fatty acid that is very protective. It reduces obesity, bad lipids, insulin resistance, reduces plaque, and other cardiac problems. Eating meat is also associated with more type 2 diabetes, as we see in some of these large cohort studies where they follow thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of people for decades to see how their diet affects their health. And in three studies shown here, what we find is eating meat will make you more likely to get prediabetes, insulin resistance, and type 2 diabetes. And if you do have diabetes, your risk of death or hospitalization is higher the more meat you eat. So if eating meat is common but seems to have some potential downside, will eating less meat make you healthier? A good question. Certainly Americans tend to think so. About 25% are thinking that, yeah, I'm going to reduce my meat and that's going to make me healthier. It's also good for the environment and animal welfare, but it's really my health I care about. A study from a few years ago in Annals of Internal Medicine, a very reputable journal by reputable investigators, created some controversy. And this group, called NutraRex, they're allegedly independent, they don't have institutional constraints or conflicts of interest. What they did was ask the question, gee, if you reduce your meat intake by about 3 servings per week, will that make you healthier? Their conclusion was, no, it seems to have little or no impact on cancer or bad outcomes with your heart, such as heart disease, heart attack, strokes, hardening of the arteries. And their recommendation was, do what you're doing. Continue eating your current levels of red meat and processed meat. Part of the problem here, and the main problem in my opinion, is it does not address the question of what fills the void. So if you reduce your meat by 3 servings and add 3 servings of cake or 3 servings of perhaps some thick shakes, you're probably not going to be healthier. Maybe if you add healthy plant foods, you might. We'll talk about that in a bit. They said they don't have conflicts of interest, but I can't help but think that when 13 of the 14 voting panel members are omnivores who eat lots of meat, including processed meat, 2 to 3 servings per week in many cases, are those the folks most likely to do a study showing that meat is bad for you when they're all meat eaters? Maybe, maybe not. I'll leave that to your contemplation. One of the greatest insights, I think, into this comes from this wonderful study in Lancet, a global study looking at 195 countries. They found that diet was killing people. Diet accounted for 22%, nearly 1 in 4 deaths were from poor diet, and mainly lots of sodium and not eating enough healthy whole foods, the whole grains and fruits. This diagram from the study shows something very, very telling. So focus your attention here, the bottom part, where we see people who eat high amounts of processed meat and red meat don't really get a lot of deaths attributable to diet. The bars are low. Of great curiosity is that what's really killing people is a lack of healthy stuff. So if you're low in whole grains, fruits, nuts, seeds, vegetables, or fiber or legumes, then you do get more deaths attributable to your diet. So it's not so much the excess meat, but the absence of the good stuff that's killing people. 1 in 4 deaths related to non-communicable diseases throughout the world. Red meat consumption and diabetes, we've spoken about before. It is correlated with increased rates of diabetes and death from diabetes. But what I want to emphasize here now is the issue of substitution. So if we substitute some meat for a healthier food, will that reduce diabetes risk? Well, yes, it does. And in this diagram here, we see all sorts of substitutions, and on the bottom, the amount of risk that is reduced by the substitution for getting diabetes. Focus your attention here where we see that substituting nuts or whole grains can reduce your risk of diabetes by about 15, 20, 25%. And you get greater reductions with nuts and whole grains when you substitute them for processed meats, which are class 1 carcinogens. And you reduce your risk there by about 30, even 35%. So it's, again, all about the substitutions. Will eating more plant foods make you healthier? I would hope that your insight is yes, given what we've said so far, but let's see. One good way to look at this is population-based studies. We have a whole slew, in this case 13 I've highlighted here, of population-based studies where they take large swaths of the population around the world, they assess their diet and other baseline factors and follow them for decades to see how their health relates to their habits and their diet. What these studies almost universally show is more healthy plant foods will reduce your rates of diabetes and obesity and high blood pressure, heart disease, the GI, the gastrointestinal, and colon cancers, and fewer deaths from these causes as well. Focusing in on a couple of these studies, the U.S. Nurses and Healthcare Workers studies with over 200,000 participants, they created a plant-based diet index. So they had about 150 questions at baseline and really analyzed in detail people's diets, and if you had a very healthy whole food plant-based diet, you got a very high plant-based diet index. If you ate junk food or lots of animal foods, it dragged it down. What they found in 3 studies related to this is that having a high plant-based diet index, eating more healthy plant-based foods, prolongs your life. It reduces your risk of diabetes and heart disease, including stroke, heart attacks, heart failure, and hardening of the arteries or blood vessel disease. If you did something very simple in this study here, just swapping out some animal products, some beef with a plant-based substitute for 8 weeks, interesting things happen. In this case, they gave people Beyond Meat for 8 weeks. They found that nasty TMAO, that stuff produced by that microbiome when you marinate it with beef and animal products, that went way down, almost in half, as a result of eating meat substitutes, as did the bad cholesterol, the LDL cholesterol. So an easy way over only 8 weeks to improve your health. Putting it together, what should you eat for health and longevity? Well, I think the message is pretty clear. It's going to be less meat and clearly more plants, but qualified by more healthy plant foods. Probably the best approach, at least in my opinion and many others, would be a whole food plant-based diet. And this is a diet that emphasizes the plant foods, the fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, beans, nuts, and seeds, and you're going to de-emphasize the bad stuff, refined carbohydrates, processed foods, ultra-processed foods, which can be 60 or 70% of a typical American diet. Avoiding oils and extracted oils products is good too. These have calories but no health benefit. And you're going to minimize generally, or if you're strict like I am, completely avoid the meat and dairy products. The Flexitarians do allow some of this to be present. Let's take a trip now to 5 places around the world where we see disproportionate numbers of centenarians. In other words, there are clusters of people who live to 100 or longer and they're healthy. And these clusters were found in California, Costa Rica, Italy, Greece, and Japan by Dan Buettner, a National Geographic researcher who identified these so-called blue zones. And he looked at their habits and found that people who live here, they're not on diets, taking vitamins, or counting grams of proteins. In fact, they celebrate with food. They love to eat. And guess what? In 4 of the 5 places, they even eat meat. Wow, they're flexitarian. But this is from free-roaming animals. They do it sparingly. It's a side, not the main protagonist of a dish. And they eat fish. But 90% or more of the diet is the whole plant foods. The fruits, vegetables, legumes, nuts, and seeds. Maybe a little dairy, but in small quantities of dairy. The Blue Zone's diet was distilled by Dan Buettner into some principles based on 150 surveys, and we see some of the conclusions here. It's similar to the whole food plant-based diet with the whole grains, some nuts, beans, and fruit, and staying away from the junk food, the processed food, the sweets, and especially processed meats. In addition to eating healthy, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention some other lifestyle things for living longer, particularly not smoking, keeping your weight down, and getting some activity, which is what was looked at in this large study here. And the healthy diet wasn't necessarily vegetarian. It did include whole grains as well as low meat, so it was more flexitarian. And they found this. If you did all 4 of these healthy things, you had very low rates of diabetes, heart attacks, and stroke and cancer. And in fact, if you did not smoke, kept your weight down, exercised, and ate healthy, you had a 78% lower risk of getting a chronic disease. Extraordinary. And I love the title of this study, Healthy Living is the Best Revenge. Some of the ways to eat healthy are shown here, these so-called plant predominant diets. The DASH is a dietary approach to stop hypertension. You can eat some fish, poultry, and lean meats, and Mediterranean, of course, also does allow quite a bit of fish, seafood, poultry, and dairy. They allow cheeses and olive oil. Flexitarian, we've spoken about a bit, allowing some meat, but other, for the most part, plant-forward, healthy, whole plant foods. Similar to a Blue Zones diet in many ways, and the whole food plant-based diet, a bit more strict, which really does not include any animal products. So all these are ways to pursue a plant-forward approach. Putting it all together, in summary, this vegetarian, flexitarian, can you still be healthy and eat meat? Well, let's look at the questions we addressed. Is eating meat good for your health? No, probably not. Lots of meat is certainly not good for you, and those processed meats are particularly problematic. But eating sparingly, it's done in many centenarians, people who live over 100 throughout the world. Will eating less meat improve your health? Generally, yes. But again, it's that question of substitution. If you knock out a few servings, as the Nutrirex folks did, doesn't do much. It's a question of replacement. If you add the healthy foods instead of meat, you're going to have a big benefit. And eating more plants in general will absolutely improve your health. There's overwhelming evidence that eating more whole plant foods can prevent, treat, and even reverse many chronic diseases that plague Americans. What should you eat for health and longevity? The key is a healthy, whole food, plant-based diet. Lots of fruits, vegetables, legumes, nuts, seeds, and whole grains. You might want to add a little meat if that's your inclination. You can do that and be flexitarian. So you have some options. Well, hopefully this has been engaging and educational for you. I can be reached at richard.rosenfeld@downstate.edu. And you can find more information at www.downstate.edu/plantbased. Thank you for listening, and live long and be healthy.